with Politics Live.
Welcome to Liverpool and the final day of the Labour Party conference. Has Keir Starmer done enough to convince voters he's the right person to lead the country? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Labour's Shadow Secretary for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, Thangham Debonair. Tom Harwood, presenter on GB News. Britain editor of The New Statesman, Anoush Chakalian. And Matt Rack, General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. Today, will Keir Starmer's promise to bulldoze through planning rules pitch him against people opposed to development where they live?
Are you going to do something to that local opposition that isn't done now? Are you basically going to say, we hear you, but I'm afraid we're ignoring you?
Yes, we're going to have to do that.
We'll ask whether the Labour leader's plan to build 1.5 million homes is realistic. Also this lunchtime, Labour pledges to turn the NHS on its head.
So it falls to us, the party that founded the NHS 75 years ago, to rescue, rebuild and renew our health service today. And we will.
Welcome to this final day of the Labour Party conference here in Liverpool. It's been an extremely busy week. Proceedings are beginning to be drawn to a close. We've had final speeches today. Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary. Wes Streeting, you heard there in the headlines, the Shadow Health Secretary. And I think I could certainly hear in the last few minutes the voice behind me of Jonathan Ashworth, the Shadow Paymaster General, who will be giving his final comments. There he is on the conference stage, talking to delegates before people begin to pack up and go home. As is traditional, we will also no doubt hear a rendition of the Red Flag, the traditional anthem of the Labour Party. We'll talk to my guests in just a moment, but I'd just like to reflect a little on Keir Starmer's speech yesterday, and particularly the thread running through his speech that was about an hour long to conference, and that was the issue of class. Let's have a listen.
My dad felt the disrespect of vocational skills all his life. But the solution is not, and never will be, the levelling down of working class aspiration to go to university. Many people here will have heard a nagging voice inside saying, no, this isn't for you. You don't belong here. You can't do that. Working class people certainly hear that voice. Trust me. In some ways, it's the hardest class ceiling of all. I grew up working class. I've been fighting all my life, and I won't stop now.
Yes, he said it again and again throughout the speech. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Thangham, is Labour the party of the working classes again?
Absolutely, we're the party of the working classes. We were founded from the trade union movement. Keir, as you said, mentioned the working class, the background that he has, how strongly that has influenced where he's gone as a person, as a professional, and now as Labour leader and I hope future Prime Minister. I think he's absolutely right, because there's such a divide in this country between people who feel entitled to have opportunities and those who are often simply shut out of them, whether that's home ownership or a decent education or a health service that they should be able to rely on. Keir's quite right to highlight that we are the party of the working classes. I'm looking forward to, and I feel very honoured to, serve with him in what I hope will be a Labour government very soon.
Do you agree with Thangham and Thangham's sort of analysis of the fact that Labour is once again the party of the working class?
It's almost interesting that this needs to be a discussion. You'd think that the Labour Party, in its founding, in its principles, would be the party of the working class. So why are we having this discussion? Well, clearly, it hasn't been in recent years. And frankly, Sir Keir Starmer standing up there We know in focus groups people think of him not particularly as someone in touch with the working class. The reason why this was a thread throughout this speech is he's almost trying to reintroduce himself to the country, trying to say things that perhaps people across the country don't know about his own background, because at the moment most people would think he's quite a well-to-do man, he's got a knighthood, he lives in a posh part of London, and perhaps that's not the best way to connect with people who are really struggling across the country.
I mean, it's interesting if you look back into relatively recent history, Anoush, you think of John Prescott, a former deputy leader of the party, a deputy prime minister, saying we're all middle class now. Boris Johnson, also from a very privileged background, claiming that he perhaps connected with working class people, certainly in what we call red wall seats, those traditional Labour heartlands. What did you make? Is Labour the party, again, of the working classes?
It's certainly more class aware than any previous Labour setup that we've seen in recent years. You mentioned John Prescott's comments about we're all middle class now. Tony Blair declared the class war over. I think this Labour Party is really different. It's very aware that people do care about class. In the recent British Social Attitude Survey, more people identified as working class than they did in the 80s, and the vast majority say that class is a barrier to opportunity. So I think they've recognised that and they've run with it.
Matt, you were nodding as Anoush was talking. You agree with that?
I think there's been a whole period where people in the Labour Party didn't want to talk about class, and as you've reflected. But with the cost of living crisis, with wages stagnating for 15 years in Britain, with the various crises, banking crisis, cost of living crisis, COVID crisis, have all exposed class inequalities in this society. And I think his comments reflect an awareness that there is this growing awareness of that class is an issue in Britain.
Right, is Keir Starmer right, though, also in his analysis, perhaps, when he's appealing to voters in the red wall? People say it's not a done deal. It's not signed and sealed in terms of winning back those seats. Is that part of the strategy?
Well, it's not a done deal because we're not at the election yet, Jo, and we know that we can't take the electorate for granted. After the catastrophic results we had 3 years ago, when we had one of the worst election results in our history, the Labour Party was on its knees. I campaigned for Keir Starmer to rebuild the Labour Party, to lead the Labour Party, because I knew how much it would make a difference to people across the country. It's not a done deal because we have to work hard for every single vote, and I think you've seen that this week. But the contrast between Keir Starmer, who, yes, has done well through his abilities and his determination and his parents' support, and Rishi Sunak, who appears completely out of touch. I think that was stark in this speech because he showed in the ways he talked about his family background and even his recent family holiday and people he's met recently, how in touch he is with what's actually going on for people who are in the cost of living crisis, that he understands it from his own experience. And that, I think, is setting us fair wind for a general election victory, but we are not going to take anyone's vote for granted. You have to earn every one.
I mean, aspiration is important. You heard it both from Rishi Sunak last week. Oh, perhaps we can just break and we might as well take a flavour of the closing with this anthem, the red flag. The anthem, the red flag there, Matt Rack, make you feel good about the Closing Labour Conference. You said recently, because you've become president of the TUC, that what you didn't want to see was austerity with a different rosette. Is that a real concern for you?
Look, I think that on the question of Labour representing workers, there's been a tension throughout the Labour Party history on that issue, to the degree to which it listens to its working class base and the trade unions and the degree to which it comes under pressure from the establishment. I think that is still a tension, and it will become, that pressure will be extended as we approach a general election. Our job in the trade unions is, as we debated, for example, trade union rights yesterday, is to say we want you to listen to workers and the voice of organised workers in the trade unions. We want you to maintain these commitments, and actually you can then start to deliver for working people.
Are you going to keep to these commitments? There is an issue of trust, isn't there, about broken promises generally across government, and that's what people think about politics. I mean, Matt Rack will probably hold your feet to the fire. We'll ask him if he'll be as strong, perhaps with a Labour government, as he perhaps is with a Conservative government. But how can you say to him, you reassure him you're going to keep to all those workers' rights you promised?
Because that's what Keir does. Keir is a man of his word. He is a man of his word.
He dropped his 10 pledges when he stood for the leadership.
Because at that time, he was dealing with a very different world. And where we are now is a stage in our process, our electoral cycle, where Keir's had time to consider what we can do and also what we can't do just yet. There will be many good Labour things that we will want to do, but will not be able to do in our first few years. But I know that Matt will, of course, hold our feet to the fire. That's quite right. Trade unions should, but so should voters up and down the country. We have made a commitment now to build 1.5 million new homes, for instance. We all know there's a housing crisis. That's a commitment which has not been plucked out of thin air. It's been carefully thought through, and I think that's really important. Keir has reformed public services before when he was in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service. That's why I campaigned for him to be leader. I knew he was the man to turn around the Labour Party, and now he's the man to lead the country.
Right, I mean, it might be easier against a backdrop of successive Conservative governments where promises have been dropped or changed, and he can present himself as much more authentic.
I don't think he can do particularly credibly. Just because some politicians are liars doesn't mean that other politicians that oppose those politicians by default are not liars. Clearly, Keir Starmer said one thing to get elected and then did another thing once in position. Now, you could argue that was a good strategy. You could argue that's changed the Labour Party. You could argue doing over his membership was a useful thing to do in the electoral interests of the Labour Party. But clearly, this was a guy who stood for the leadership, saying he'd defend freedom of movement, he would nationalise most industry, he would raise taxes on the top earners, and now what we're seeing is precisely the opposite. He even stood for election saying that he would cancel HS2, and now he presents himself as a defender of HS2.
Although,
this is a guy who's had every issue on every subject.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, you're sitting there listening to that. Has he done over the membership?
Look, I've got differences with Keir on the question that Thangham raised about his pledges. I think he should have stuck to his pledges. If you stand for election in the Labour leadership, then you should stick to those pledges. I also think that rowing back on some of the public ownership pledges is a mistake. I think they're hugely popular. People are
hugely expensive.
People are fed up with being ripped off by energy companies, by water companies pumping sewage into their rivers, and they want people held to account, and they want to see democratic public ownership of those sectors.
You're going to still campaign for that,
yeah,
are you?
We're going to still campaign. I mean, we passed resolutions this week on that issue.
Well, I mean, Thangham,
I think in a cost of living crisis, what people care most about is what's going to help right now with bringing down their bills. Billions of pounds
are their bills going to come down immediately?
If we insulate 1.9 million leaky, drafty homes each year, yes, they will. If we invest in renewable energy, which we're going to, yes, they will.
I mean, this argument makes sense in one way, right? Which is, okay, the fiscal situation of the country has changed, but there are policies that were revenue neutral, that weren't even to do with spending, that Keir Starmer has gone back on. Take his promise to reform the Gender Recognition Act and trans rights. He's completely U-turned on that. Take his promise to continue free movement with the European Union. He's completely U-turned on that. These aren't fiscal pledges. This has nothing to do with the economic situation of the country. Well, these are clear U-turns on other issues.
Well, and on the issue, if I can just return to nationalisation, because actually Matt Rack is right. There were motions passed here at conference. People watching the conference and programmes like Politics Live will think, I don't understand, if Labour members, Anoush, voted for renationalising key utilities, why isn't the Labour Party going to include it as part of their manifesto and programme for government?
Well, that's the oddity of conference, because you have these motions passed which show what the emphasis of Labour members want to be in the Labour manifesto, but they don't get taken into the policy-making process. In fact, the National Policy Forum was in summer before this conference. But it does make things awkward for the leadership sometimes. Last year, members voted overwhelmingly for proportional representation. That's something the leadership doesn't want to bring in, but it does make it awkward because it seems out of touch with its power base. And it's been the same on Brexit as well. There were so many battles over what Brexit motions would get passed on the floor.
Should the leadership take notice?
Yeah, but it's not new. The Labour Party has had this is a history of the Labour Party of tension between the conference and the membership and the leadership of the Labour Party. The job for activists, the delegates here and the trade unions is to then argue their corner about what should be in a Labour manifesto. We're not at that process yet, but we will certainly be going into that process with our agenda as a fire brigade union and also with our colleagues in other unions saying we think you need a stronger manifesto on these points. We will get pushback. We're aware of all that.
All right, but what are you going to do? Let's say Labour wins the election next year, as many people believe they will, and you have your workers' rights manifesto. Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, was sitting where Thangham is yesterday saying we are going to honour those pledges, more or less. If things change and they can't, what will you do?
Well, I don't expect that to happen. Actually, on that point, I think we've done a good campaign, the trade unions working with key Labour people to develop a programme on trade union rights. It doesn't go as far as we want as the Fire Brigade Union, but it goes a long way. What I said in conference yesterday, it begins a process of starting to turn the tide on 40 years of tax on trade unions. But we will be determined to make sure that a Labour government coming in will honour those pledges, and if not, there will be, frankly, disagreements about it.
Keir and Angela have worked with the trade union movement on that. We have had a democratic process that's gone into our National Policy Forum, which is the long list for the manifesto, and Angela Rayner, who has done a brilliant job of leading on the workers' rights agenda, has committed repeatedly, and I think we will all be sticking to this because we all want it, to the workers' rights agenda coming in within the first few months, I believe. Now, that matters because we also hear from businesses, and goodness, we've had a lot of businesses here represented this week, that they want to see this too. They know that if you actually have a solid workers' rights agenda across all business sectors, that you are going to improve things all around.
I'm just going to say goodbye to Matt Rack because I think you have to go. Thank you very much for joining us. But Anoush, you wanted to say something, then I'll come back to you, Tom.
I think there's definitely a tension here down the road because Unite, which is still Labour's biggest financial backer, a big union in this country, hasn't signed up to this workers' rights platform because they believe that it's been rowed back on, particularly on things like collective bargaining and trade union access. I spoke to Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, just before this conference, and she said they would still be pushing against that rowback. So I think it is you're going to come under a lot of scrutiny in terms of sticking to those policies.
There's clearly been a murky deal done. I was here a few weeks ago for the TUC conference when Angela Rayner made that speech, put forward those ideas, and it involved repealing the 2015 Trade Union Act. That's an act that takes power away from trade union barons and gives it to trade union members. It's about minimum turnout thresholds so that strikes are democratic. Repealing that act makes strikes less democratic. That takes power away from trade union members.
All right, we're going to end that bit there and talk about one of the other key themes in Keir Starmer's speech, and that was about building. We're going to be builders, not blockers, particularly new homes and new towns. Let's have a listen.
So today we launch a new plan to get Britain building again, a signal of our determination to fight the blockers who hold a veto over British aspiration. No more land bankers sitting comfortably on brownfield sites while rents in their communities rise. No more councils refusing to develop a local plan because they prefer the backdoor deal.
Now, all the papers have been reflecting on the speech this morning, but let's take a look at this headline in the Financial Times. It says, Starmer pledges to bulldoze planning regulations in new house building era. Now, this reports that Labour are looking at things like a planning passport that would fast-track housing developments on brownfield sites. Keir Starmer also said yesterday that in some cases the green belt is actually what he calls the grey belt, if you hadn't heard it, things like disused car parks. We also heard Keir Starmer in the headline speaking on the BBC this morning that he will be prepared to ignore local opposition to new homes. Is that realistic?
I think it's going to be really difficult. Boris Johnson promised the most radical planning reform since the Second World War in 2020. That was so difficult because of the MPs that represented areas that didn't want that building on their land. And it's the same with all of these Labour MPs who are quite likely to get in the next election. Some of them are going to be representing beautiful bits of countryside, and they're not going to want to serve just one term.
Thangham, is it realistic?
We're not going to build on beautiful bits of countryside. In fact, the Labour Party has always defended our right to green space. We want to have more of that, but we know that there are parts of land that are designated green belts that frankly aren't beautiful countryside. And we also all know we have a housing crisis. We have a housing crisis in home ownership, which is a dream that so many people are never going to make at the moment.
But it's about delivery, as you know, Thangham, and we've told and spoken to governments, Conservative governments, who have not honoured those pledges at all on house building. But how many disused car parks, to use Keir Starmer's phrase, are really on the green belt?
I mean, I think if we just go back a moment, Jo, if you mentioned broken Tory promises, we could spend the entire show going through broken Tory promises.
We did it last week with the Tories.
So 1.5 million new homes, we desperately need them. And that's been a well-worked
many disused car parks, are
Well, it won't just be disused car parks. There are other areas of brownfield land, that are designated green belt that we can use. But the key thing here is getting quality homes, resilient homes for climate change, and getting them built quickly. So speeding up the planning process is vital. And because the Tories have managed to mess up their planning reforms doesn't mean we're going to. We are a completely different party who knows that the aspiration of home ownership really matters to people, and we're going to build homes.
And it is true, Tom, that it matters to people. It matters to your generation, particularly, for whom it is extremely difficult to either rent or buy a home. Politically, if Labour wins the election and actually manages to unleash a house building programme, it will be a huge win, won't it?
It certainly would be if the Labour Party was actually living up to their rhetoric. Now, to answer Thangham's question, 11% of brownfield land is actually in the green belt. It's an extraordinary statistic, and the Labour Party should be commended for taking on that challenge. But where they shouldn't be commended is rolling back from the idea that they were going to deliver sweeping planning reform. What we've just been talking about now is iterative, piecemeal development. What we've been talking about now is a planning passport here or a development corporation there, not an overwhelming reform of the planning system, not the introduction of zoning like Robert Jenrick wanted to do back in 2020. What the Labour Party is talking about, but what the Labour Party is talking about here is taking a bulldozer to the planning system. What the actual policy is little individual projects here and there, a new town there, some urban intensification here, not an overwhelming reform to the system, as Labour promised. They've already rode back from that.
Right, Craig Beaumont has joined us, Federation of Small Businesses. Welcome to you. Just listening to this, what's your general observation? Can it be delivered?
I think it can be. I think you've seen a conference here which has moved from education to build. It's all about ambition. Today is not a manifesto launch, so we didn't expect lots of small policies to come out and match that, but it's the clear direction of this party, which is a massive change. Now, for next year, we should have this competition for people seeking homes. Who is going to be the best trusted person to build 1.5 million homes? And at the moment, I would say people are leaning in this direction because there's a clear drive here and that hasn't been here before. Now, they do need to do policy. There needs to be a small house builder strategy. There needs to be looking at brownfield tax free. There's all these things that they can do, but today wasn't the day for that.
What's the biggest obstacle to, yes, having a house building programme on the sort of scale and size that Keir Starmer has outlined, because that is the part of his core mission to get growth?
Well, I think it's about enabling the industry. So the industry has moved towards having these big players, and the big players aren't really interested in small sites. So we need to see small sites across the country. It isn't just big urban development. It should be people around towns, around cities. And I think that's more about the vision. And then you look at capacity in the industry. So do you have the skills? Do you have the people? Now, that isn't there at the moment.
Right.
So if you look at the 300,000 a year original target, but it's going to be weighted towards the end, you need to grow the industry. What are the apprenticeships going to come through? If you make the apprenticeship levy more flexible, can you guarantee getting young people? But if you make it flexible, it means fewer apprenticeships. So you've got to kind of resolve that tension to get more apprenticeship starts in the system.
Why are we only talking about 300,000 homes a year? That's what Harold Macmillan managed to. 1.5 million over the course of a parliament, 300,000 a year. That's the Labour Party policy.
Yes.
That's what Harold Macmillan did half a century ago. We've got a much larger population now. We've got much more of an acute housing crisis, and we have much more knowledge about how to build things. Why is there such a lack of ambition for the Labour Party?
Because
even the Lib Dems now have a target of 380,000 a year.
We should only promise what we know we can deliver, and that's really important for rebuilding trust with the country. This country's been let down by politicians who have broken their promises over 13 years of Tory government. You would be criticising me, Tom, if we were making a promise that you knew we couldn't keep. We have to be able to say, we will do this. Now, wouldn't it be marvellous if we actually exceed that 300,000? That's the right way round. I think that's what we've got to do.
How can you exceed that 300,000?
Well,
if you are doing a top-down approach of saying we're going to have a town here and a town there, what you need to do is what you originally promised, which was sweeping planning reform, taking a bulldozer to the planning system, which you're not doing.
Yes,
in fact, senior advisors to the Labour Party I've been talking to over this week have told me it's about tweaking the system to deliver more housing.
I don't know which senior advisors you're talking to, Tom, but the ones I'm talking to, the ones who actually advise us, we have worked really hard on a plan that is credible, that is going to deliver housing to your generation, to other people who want to downsize at the end of their working careers. We need those homes, and we need them to be built in a way that you can believe in. Otherwise, voters in the Red Wall, the South Coast, they're not going to trust us, and they won't. If we try and pledge things that we can't deliver, people aren't stupid, they'll spot it, and they won't vote.
Well, let's have a look at the practical challenge. Back to your point, Craig, do we have enough builders to build these homes?
Not at the moment. So you've got young people who are too far away from the world of work, and these are people who should be brought into the... If this is going to be the challenge, this is going to be the big ambition, how do you get young people attracted into construction? How do you unblock things like late payments in the construction sector? It's the worst one. So if you're a small house builder at the moment, you will be struggling to get paid within 120 days, let alone the 30 that the rest of the economy should be aiming for. So there's things to unblock, and the government has a role to that, but it's about finding people and then empowering small businesses to build the homes we need.
And does that mean more migration then?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Immigration has been a sort of topic that hasn't come up at this conference at all. I mean, there's been silence on the subject. Compare that with the Conservative Party conference. Immigration came up a lot, albeit about the small boats issue rather than immigration.
And this is legal, legal immigration and shortage occupation list, for example.
Yes, exactly. So we do actually have a more liberal immigration system now than we did before the Brexit vote. We have record levels. Not something that often gets mentioned by the Conservative Party, but that's true. Would Labour sort of take that on and then make it even more liberal? You know, because one of the problems with the system that we have now is bringing in enough low-skilled migration. And I don't say that as in a disparaging way, but the people who might come and start help to build these houses that we've just been talking about.
Right, do you accept that actually we might need more migration because we've got these occupations that have been added relatively recently: bricklayers and masons, roofers, roof tilers and slaters, carpenters and joiners, plasterers, construction and building trades.
But that's because there hasn't been investment in skills. And it's absolutely right that we should be investing in skills so that we can grow homegrown labour, but also that we have a planned, carefully thought through way of running the migration system. Now, we've got occupations on the shortage occupation list that frankly have been there far, far too long, and they speak to a lack of training and skill strategy by this government and previous Tory governments. That's the answer there. Now, we will always need to have an economy where people from this country go and live in other countries for a time and vice versa. We have to have, however, a skills strategy that is attached to our migration policy so that when you have firm, fair rules, that they are also placed on employers who are failing to train up the right skills workforce in their own areas.
Right, I mean, there is a gap, isn't there? I mean, are employers failing too here? It's always been easy, I mean, to quote a previous Prime Minister, to use the lever of immigration, of perhaps cheaper immigration coming from abroad.
Well, small businesses say that they don't actually recruit from the world. They don't go abroad and recruit. They recruit people who are here with the right to work. So we don't ascribe to the, getting in cheap immigration to fill vacancies. But they're struggling to recruit people, and therefore you do need to look at young people. You need to look at the hundreds of thousands who are furthest from the world of work, people who are unwell, people who have been disabled, people who we need to attract back. So you need both elements. Some of the immigration you need, but only with small employers not being charged too.
But that is also part of this mission-based approach that Keir's making and has pledged and is so clear on, because with 3 million people waiting on a waiting list and unable to work, 7.7 million in total on an NHS waiting list, that's holding us back. That means we've got sick people who could be working for your members.
Yes.
So it's not just about the one piece here and one piece there. We need a skills strategy, an industrial strategy and a reforming approach to the NHS so that you can get healthy workers back to work.
I think it's a great plan, but it takes time to skill people up. And I think what Labour wants to do is from day one start, changing the system and get that growth growing, because otherwise, they're going to use the money from the growth to put into public services.
So when will the technical colleges come online? That's actually really important for us.
I know, and I think Bridget Phillipson at the moment, she announced that this morning, that's part of what we want to do as I understand it, in the first term. But Anoush, you're quite right, we need to get growth going. I've spoken to so many business owners this week, business leaders, who said they're ready to grow. What they need from a government is stability and fiscal sound money so that they can plan for the future. Now, with that, they've already got capital that they can invest. And that's important because they've been waiting for a government that gave them the stability to plan for the future. And that's what we've done this week. We have given Britain its future back.
Just on the politics, both Tom and Anoush, the reality is that if Labour win the election, there will be Labour MPs who will say, no, I'm not voting in favour of having more homes and new towns in my area. That's what happened to the previous Conservative administrations, and that will be difficult.
There are already Labour MPs who are some of the most fervent not in my backyard campaigners in Parliament. You only have to look at Rupa Huck opposing just about any building in her constituency that's over 1 story tall. I'm not even exaggerating there. We've seen the Member of Parliament for York Central campaigning against facilities in her constituency because they might be slightly noisy. I mean, you get these Labour MPs who are just as bad as the worst Tories on this, and that's a fundamental in the system, which is why I think that the Labour Party has rowed back from its idea on big planning reform and is doing the Michael Gove approach. Michael Gove in July announced a little bit added to Cambridge, a bit added to Leeds, some stuff in East London. This is precisely the same thing.
Hang on, is that
Michael Gove proposed 250,000 homes on the side.
And where are they? He gave back 1.9 billion to the Treasury because he just couldn't get the money out to build homes.
Let me get a final thought from Anoush. How will Labour deal with that?
Well, I mean, you saw in Starmer's interview that you played at the top of the programme that he will ignore them. Now, I'd like to see whether or not that actually happens. It's very difficult to ignore these new Labour MPs who have come in, if we're to expect the election goes as is sort of predicted by the polls, and then say, well, actually, you know, I'm going to let your new constituents vote you out next time, because, you know, these are things that really do anger people if it's happening in their backyard. I understand the frustration with NIMBYs.
And here's the big worry, right? These new towns, we don't know where they are. We're going to hear a consultation after the election about where they are. If the Labour Party was serious about steamrolling opposition to their plans, they'd say before the election where they are, then no one could be in any doubt about how these things are going to get built. If they don't say where they are first, they're not going to get built.
I'm going to say goodbye and thank you to you, Craig Beaumont. Thank you for coming onto the programme. I said a little earlier, and you heard in the headlines, a clip of Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary's speech. Let's listen to a little bit more of it.
I'm blunt about the fact that the NHS is no longer the envy of the world, not to undermine it, but to reassure people that we've noticed. I argue that our NHS must modernise or die, not as a threat, but a choice. The crisis really is that existential. To answer the historic calling of our founders, Labour's reform agenda will turn the NHS on its head. From hospital to community, analogue to digital, sickness to prevention, a neighbourhood health service as much as a national health service, pioneering cutting-edge treatment and technology, preventing ill health, not just treating it.
So that was Wes Streeting, or part of his speech, the Shadow Health Secretary, talking about reform. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Philip Banfield, who is the Council Chair of the BMA. Before we go to you, Dr. Banfield, this turning the NHS on its head, is that what the NHS needs? Another sort of top-down reorganisation or whatever it is that's being suggested by Wes Streeting?
When I last visited my GP, I talked with the community health nurse there about prevention. She said how much money we could save in the NHS if we had a prevention approach.
I don't think people would disagree
and more
with you on that.
Well, good, because the neighbourhood approach, I think, is really, really important. I love what Wes is saying, because it's not just about more neighbourhood approaches and prevention. It's also about harnessing the power of digital, tech and artificial intelligence to make better diagnoses earlier, sooner, have more scanners so that we can do that better.
Sorry about the announcement.
All delegates, please start making their way to the entrance.
Well, there you go. The official closing of Labour Party Conference 2023. Politics Live still has 12 minutes to go.
Very much live. We're going to get dismantled around our ears.
No, we're not. It's not going to literally clap. Sorry, finish your
thought. I mean, I think the thing is about Wes's approach is that he is trying to harness the power of the 21st century to make an NHS fit for the 21st century. Keir spelled out that yesterday in his speech as well. We need to get workers off waiting lists, able to work again, and having more early diagnosis sooner saves money. And that's how we free up more taxpayers' money and get more value for taxpayers.
Dr. Banfield, does that reassure and satisfy you and your members?
No, not at all. It's a great idea. It's much more difficult to deliver in practice. I mean, while we're waiting for people to have their illnesses prevented, we've got everyone with those illnesses, and we don't have the resources to deal with that now. You know, what would be much more sensible at the same time as investing in prevention is making sure that we get through the 7 million backlog. What we could do with is having these people treated and back in work. I like the emphasis on family doctors investing in general practice. That is the most efficient and effective part of our health service. We've seen places like Wales, for example, invest heavily in prevention, but then run into difficulties because they've not been able to afford to treat people in their hospitals. We've had 13 years of austerity and a population that's been getting sicker, and we have to deal with the consequences of that. So there needs to be a transitional amount of money that takes us from the current health service to the health service of the future.
All right, well, just let me take that point. What about that transition that Dr. Banfield is talking about? What he is talking about is it does need money, and we heard very clearly from Sir Keir Starmer yesterday, no chequebook. Not just for the NHS, but broadly for...
But we have also said that we will abolish the non-DOMS tax break for the super rich so that people who live here pay their fair share of taxes and use that money to invest in workforce expansion for the NHS. The current Tory government has also, after being dragged there kicking and screaming, frankly, also come round to the idea that they need to invest in the workforce. We're going to add to that. We think that's really important because, of course, he's right. We need to clear that backlog. We can do two things at once, I believe. I think it's important because the health service is crying out for the sort of respect, the investment, the resourcing, but also the prevention approach that we're set out this morning.
Right, so Dr. Banfield, will the strikes continue if Labour wins the next election and it's a case of just over £3 billion from the scrapping of the non-DOM status that we hear an awful lot about, the reforms that are being set out by Wes Streeting? Will that be enough for the strikes of junior doctors and consultants to be called off?
Well, there is a fundamental difference between the rhetoric from the Conservative Party and from Labour. You know, it's really difficult to have a pay dispute if one side refuses to talk about pay. And we do have a commitment from Labour, as Wes Streeting said yesterday morning on a panel with me, to sit down and value staff. There isn't a blank checkbook to do this all at once, but we have never claimed that it needs to be all at once. And we did see during the previous Labour government that a recognition of the erosion of the value of pay and pay restoration across their term of office. So all things are possible, and I would be optimistic.
All right, well, you're optimistic. Some might say that perhaps the strike, certainly the Conservatives say, that they're ideological because of a Conservative government. Rishi Sunak last week said this, that doctors have been given a 9% pay rise, and that's more than the nurses, more than hospital porters, more than anyone else in the public sector. In other words, how can you justify the continuation on strikes when that sort of offer has been put on the table?
Well, of course, that isn't actually a true statement because this government settled for 15% with barristers, and it's also an untruth that the nurses settled. They just were not able to get across a threshold to keep their strike action going. So that's a little bit disingenuous.
But my point is, Dr. Banfield, of Rishi Sunak, fine, but let me just put this to you. But if Labour, and they certainly haven't said yet, they may, of course, as you say, if they win next year, sit down and negotiate in a way that you find certainly more attractive than a Conservative government. But if there's no more money on the table, and we haven't heard any more money being made available for pay, will you continue the strikes?
We will continue these strikes until the expertise of doctors is valued appropriately in the health service. There is plenty of money that could be redirected. We need that expertise. There are a lot of resources being wasted at the moment on locum staff, extra contractual payments, the private sector. All of this could be redirected into getting us treating patients.
All right, well, Sangam. I mean, if you don't restore pay in the way that has been demanded by the BMA, I mean, junior doctors' pay has fallen by 14% since 2010, pay for consultants has fallen by 15% since 2010, the strikes continue, and patients don't get those appointments under a Labour government.
The first thing that Dr Banfield mentioned was the lack of negotiation on the government's part. So the first thing that matters to me is that we get back into proper negotiations. Under 13 years of Labour government, not a single strike in the NHS.
Oh.
And it's because we talked. It's because we talked. We talked and we negotiated, and yes, we had disagreements, but we were able to resolve them. Now, at the moment, that's not happening, as Dr Banfield has said.
Tom?
There were local strikes in the NHS, there weren't national strikes, and it's interesting that most Labour politicians will use that qualifier just to sneak around the definitional points there. But I want to step back a little bit and look at actually the funding of the NHS as a whole, because this is never discussed on the television. In 2010, the NHS had a £130 billion budget. £130 billion in 2023 pounds, adjusted for inflation. This year, it's £180 billion.
We do discuss
That's a £50 billion increase.
But the rate
That's
of increase
almost
has slowed down, hasn't it?
extra a week.
Yeah, but the rate of increase has slowed down.
Well, it massively sped up and then it slowed down again.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
But let's have a look at those two numbers, right? 130 to 180, £50 billion more, 40% more cash being spent
So
on
you
this
agree
health
with Wes
service.
Streeting? It's reform, not more money that's needed.
Wes Streeting is plainly right there, but I haven't seen the detail of any sort of proper reform that would get that money spent well.
Well, I actually disagree. I do think Wes Streeting does talk about that quite a lot. In his speech just now, I was in the hall and he was saying how much money had been put into the NHS, but yet look at the way that it's performing. And that's why he said that reform is more important than investment, which is, would have been a hard message for a hall of the Labour Party faithful to hear, even a year, 2 years ago. But now there seems to be acceptance of that. And interestingly, there is acceptance among the public as well that the NHS needs more than just money.
And yet you get these gimmicks over non-dom status, which will raise a tiny amount of money. Most economists suggest it's between £1 or £3 billion, right? And that, as a proportion of the amount that's gone into the NHS over the last decade, it's tiny, it's fractional.
But if it clears
and
the
yet
backlog,
that's the
Tom,
That's
if it
the
clears the backlog, that's going to help us. And if we do the reforms that are necessary, we'll get better value for taxpayers' money.
Trying to suggest
when
to
we
me
have
today that
better
there's only
value,
£1 billion more that was needed? After all this time,
when we
only
have
£1
better
billion
value
more.
for taxpayers' money, we will be able to invest in the scanners that we need in order to diagnose serious disease sooner, treat people quicker. That's better for their health, it's better for the economy, and it's better for the NHS's finances.
I'm going to thank Dr Banfield for joining us here on the final day of the Labour Party conference. Thank you to you. I just want to get final thoughts because, as you say, it's sort of being dismantled around us. It is the end of the conference. But yes, what will you go away with? What's the one thought in your mind, Anoush, from this conference?
This is the most different Labour conference that I've ever seen. I've been coming since 2012 to these conferences. The party feels very different. They're accepting these lines about fiscal responsibility. In Rachel Reeves' speech, she mentioned economic credibility, and there was a whoop and a cheer from the crowd. That's the kind of cheer you used to get, when former party leaders used to make digs at the Murdoch press, or talk about how much they love the NHS heroes. It's different, and I think it shows that the party has managed to move it towards sort of an election-ready kind of outfit.
Do you think he spoke to the people outside this conference hall too, Keir Starmer, because obviously that's what he needs to do ahead of a general election?
I've been coming to these Labour conferences since 2018, so not quite as long, but this is the first Labour conference I've seen with quite so many union flags and quite so few Palestinian flags. This is the first Labour conference that I've seen where more people are wearing suits and ties than perhaps T-shirts and jeans. This is the first Labour conference where I've seen so many corporate exhibitors and people who are really trying to get their message out in front of the leadership of the Labour Party. This was a very different conference to even last year, where everyone was existing in a state of sort of paralysed giddiness, where for the first time they were ahead in the polls. It seems like this is a party that is tentatively on the brink of government, and everyone here knows it.
Well, thank you both for your resounding tributes.
Did you prime them?
Yesterday, I think what Keir did, and I think a lot of people were really moved by that, Keir gave Britain its future back, and I think he did that by spelling out a clear vision that was personal to him and reflected his character, the reasons why I campaigned for him to be leader of the Labour Party, and I want him to be Prime Minister as soon as possible.
Well, that's a note to end on. Thanks very much from all of us. Bye-bye.
All around the planet, animals